So at this time, I am going to begin unmuting people. So you can type questions in the Q&A box. I'll read them aloud. But first, while I let everyone kind of gather their questions, I am going to ask a few questions that I prepared myself.
Sure.
So how do you think COVID-19 has influenced the discussion of climate change? And do you see the pandemic as a means to the end for the way that the fossil fuel industry is currently operating?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. And it's one I think a lot of us are asking. It's hard not to ask that question because there seem to be so many implications. For one, I think, more than anything else, it sort of, to me, the pandemic lays bare sort of our vulnerability. We have this global population of 7.8 billion and growing people who are dependent on this intricate infrastructure that we've created that leverages the resources far beyond the natural carrying capacity of this planet. And we are so dependent on technology and the functioning of that technology. And something like this comes along, it teaches us how vulnerable we are. There's also an environmental message. There is some evidence that these pandemics, these global pandemics, are being at least exacerbated by environmental destruction, by the destruction of rainforests and ecosystems that are forcing organisms outside of their usual patterns where they're coming into contact with people. And so you get these diseases that are spread by exotic animals to human beings. And so there's also this sense in which our destruction of the environment appears to be leading to new global health problems, these pandemics. And so I think it also, the pandemic also communicates the importance of us finding a way to live more sustainably on this planet. And then finally, of course, we have seen that we can have a fairly sizable impact. Our actions do make a difference. Carbon emissions have dropped, the air is cleaner, the water is cleaner. We've seen the relationship that exists between our activities and sort of the health of our environment. And so I think there's this renewed appreciation of the fact that we do have a role in helping maintain a sustainable planet for us and other living things. I could go on down the list. The dangers of anti-science, the fact that the catastrophic policies of the current administration, which we can literally measure the cost now in tens of thousands of human lives. The cost of rejecting the findings of science, rejecting scientists for purely, in this case, economic reasons. In the case of climate change denial, of course, the economic reason is that the Republican Party has become essentially an advocate for the fossil fuel industry and has done the bidding of the fossil fuel industry at the expense of the good of the people that they are supposed to be representing. In this case, of course, the economic slowdown is a threat to Trump's reelection prospects. And if Trump doesn't get reelected, then the big polluters and all the other special interests don't have the opportunity that they've had to advance their agenda of deregulation. So it's really, there are so many lessons that we can take away from this pandemic, and I hope we take away the right lessons, and I hope we recognize more than anything else the true cost, the true damage of ideologically and politically motivated science denial. It's been laid bare now by this pandemic in the disastrous response of the current administration, or I should say the disastrous lack of response of the current administration, and the literal purveying of anti-science, where the president, where Trump has literally used the bully pulpit to promote interventions that don't represent a true solution to the problem and might actually kill people.
Great. Thank you, Mike. We have a question from Joanne. So kind of bouncing off the idea of individuals and how they can't really make a big difference, how can local elected officials make the needed changes at our level?
Thanks. That's a great question. And, you know, I think of Peter Buck, who's taken a real leadership role here in State College in promoting clean energy and helping Penn State find ways to transition to clean energy, building massive solar arrays, for example, to help power the university off renewable energy, which is now cost competitive. In fact, the university realizes that it can actually save money by investing in solar energy and getting off fossil fuels. At the national level, over the last few years, of course, with a divided Congress and an executive branch that is, that is in the hip pocket of the fossil fuel industry, there really hasn't been any opportunity for climate action at the national level. And indeed, we have seen the opposite. We've seen a dismantling of policies that were put in place by the Obama administration to help us get off fossil fuels, to help us move towards renewable energy. So in the absence of national leadership, we've had to rely on leadership at the local level, at the municipal level, at the level of cities and states that have banded together. And because of that, because of the New England states, the Mid-Atlantic states, and I'm proud that Pennsylvania joined RGGI, this consortium of Northeastern states that are working to incentivize renewable energy and price carbon. And you've got the West Coast states that also have formed a consortium. So it turns out you've got more than 30% of the population of the country now is in a state where there are state level incentives for getting off fossil fuels, even in the absence of a national sort of climate policy, a national progress at the national level. So because of that, we might actually come close to meeting our Paris obligations, even with Donald Trump literally threatening to withdraw from Paris because of the progress that we've been seeing at the local level, local politicians, state politicians, states banding together. So what we need to do is to continue that. We need, we need good politicians working at the local level to advance local efforts to that incentivize sustainability, that incentivize renewable energy, that help us get off burning carbon. We need all of that action to continue at the local level, at the state level. Then if we get back the leadership at the national level with a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president, we'll really be able to hit the ground running. And so we need, we need support for these policies at all levels, and it's actually the local levels, largely Democrats at the local level, who have allowed us to make some progress, even when there has been sort of this tide, this national tide working against us.
Great, thank you, Mike. So kind of bouncing off that question as well, from Ezra, it is, what are the most impactful or important ways that we can take action in our daily lives to contribute to the climate?
Thanks, that's a great question. At some level, it's an easy one. Vote, vote, okay. Vote on climate. We get the politicians we vote for, and it's very difficult, it's very difficult to make any progress when we have climate change denying politicians and fossil fuel lobbyists running our national energy and climate policy. The fox literally guarding the hen house. It's very difficult for us to make the sort of progress and to be a good sort of global citizen, to keep up our end of the bargain as the rest of the world works to solve this problem, to work collaboratively with other countries. It's so difficult to do all those things when you don't have political leadership that represents the people over the polluters. So the only way we get the politicians that we deserve and that we need is by voting and making sure that other people vote and fighting the cynicism, an effort underway by bad state actors and conservative forces that are trying to divide the Democrats. They're trying to once again disenfranchise voters and basically suppress enthusiasm for voting, especially among younger people who seem to be fall victim to the sort of cynicism that some of the forces of who are trying to divide us are employing. So we need to fight that cynicism. We need to fight the idea that it doesn't matter, that the two parties are somehow the same. This false equivalency that is so often used as an argument by our younger folks not to vote, not to engage. We need to fight that, because that is the greatest threat, I think, right now, when it comes to this next election and when it comes to voting in politicians who will be on the right side on these issues. There are, of course, as we know, lots of things that we can do at the local level, and that is important. We need to pressure our local politicians to support policies that incentivize renewable energy, that encourage more sustainable practices. And that's true of agriculture, as well as energy production and transportation and everything else. We should be doing all those things. They're all important. But in the end, it almost doesn't matter if we don't have leadership at the top level, at the state level, and at the national level. And the only way we get that is by voting and turning out the vote and fighting the fairly underhanded tactics that are underway to dispirit Democratic voters, to keep them from coming to the polls and to voting for politicians who favor these policies.
Great, thank you, Mike. So we have a question from Dorothy. When you spoke about systemic solutions, you seemed to first mention putting a price on carbon. As you know, Citizens Climate Lobby takes this as their target. How can we help people understand the importance of this step?
Thanks. It's so important, because one of I talk about the forces that have been trying to divide us. And one of the things that they've been trying to do is to divide Democrats and progressives on the issue of carbon pricing. There are good ways and bad ways of doing carbon pricing. There are ways of doing carbon pricing that end up being regressive, that hurt frontline communities, and we don't want to do that. We want to make sure that any transition to clean energy is a just transition. And so it's important to understand that carbon pricing is not intrinsically regressive. There are a lot of progressives now who think that that's the case, because there has been a propaganda campaign to make them think that that's the case. It's actually the forces of denial have actually been trying to convince progressives that that carbon pricing is intrinsically regressive and not consistent with environmental justice. And that's not true. In the end, it depends on how we do that carbon pricing, how we take that revenue and we return it to the people, for example, in a way that is progressive and that actually ends up helping those at the lower strata of our economy and frontline communities. And that's the way it was actually in Australia, and that's the way it is in Canada. Actual carbon pricing mechanisms that have been put in place at the national level in other countries have ended up being progressive. So we need to make sure that that gets out. Citizens Climate Lobby, as far as I'm concerned, is doing God's work. They have played such an important role in communicating the importance, along with incentives for renewable energy. We have to do that, but that alone isn't going to get us the cuts in carbon emissions we need. We also need to make sure that there's a cost for dumping carbon pollution into our atmosphere, that the industry has to pay a price for dumping that pollution into our atmosphere. And that's what carbon pricing is about. And Citizens Climate Lobby has been promoting a revenue neutral form of carbon pricing that ends up returning revenue to the people in a progressive manner. So it does lead to a just transition, and it puts a cost, it puts a price on dumping pollution into the atmosphere. That's half of it. The other half is providing explicit incentives for renewable energy. We need both. These are the two main tools that we have, and we're literally tying one of our hands behind the back when we preemptively decide that one of them is off the table.
Thank you, Mike. So one question from Linda is, what are the best philanthropies or organizations to support surrounding this issue?
To support, what was that?
to support around climate change?
Uh,
So different philanthropies or organizations.
Yeah, thanks. It's always a challenging question because you always end up leaving out, afterwards. Oh, why didn't I mention? I've done a lot of work. The sort of, the many of the usual suspects. The environmental, non-governmental organizations. The Sierra Club does wonderful work. The Union of Concerned Scientists. I really like the work that they do because a lot of it is science advocacy and defending the science and scientists from industry-funded attacks. So each of these groups plays a different role. I love what Greenpeace does. I love what Bill McKibben's organization 350.org does. And I'm going to forget somebody, but contribute to these groups. At the local level, often there are local chapters that you can get involved in, and of course there are the national organizations as well, because each of them end up playing a slightly different role and sort of fill a different niche. But they're all helping, to sort of advance the larger cause of environmental sustainability. And I'm sure I could think of others. I would be, in fact, remiss not to mention the National Center for Science Education. I'm on their board of directors, and they do really important work in defending the teaching of environmental science in schools, again, which is under attack by those same conservative interests.
Thank you. We have a question from Betsy. How do we message the importance of climate action to Republican voters? We obviously know that we need their votes to elect strong climate action candidates and to enact climate-friendly legislation.
Yeah, it's so ironic. Here in Pennsylvania, of course, the legacy of the Republican Party, the great John Heinz was a Republican, and of course the Heinz Foundation supports environmental advocacy today. There was a time when the partisan divide on issues of environmental sustainability, environmental protection, was not nearly as great as it is today. In fact, ironically, a lot of the great environmental policy successes actually happened in the past under Republican presidents. The EPA was formed under Richard Nixon. The Clean Air and Clean Water Acts under Nixon and Bush. Reagan actually supported the Montreal Protocol. They weren't all perfect on the environment, but it used to be the case that you could find support for basic environmental protections on both sides of the aisle. And even, as Sherwood Boehlert, who was the former chair of the House Science Committee, was an old school pro-environment, pro-science Republican, was a personal friend of mine. He stepped down some years ago. John McCain was a supporter of policy efforts to act on climate. Unfortunately, at some point, within the last 15 years or so, we did see this divergence where the Koch brothers and the fossil fuel interests have had an increasingly tighter stranglehold on the Republican Party. And the Koch brothers have essentially implemented purity tests where they will primary a Republican who supports climate action out of their position. This happened to my friend Bob Inglis from South Carolina, who's a Republican congressman who supported action on climate. He was primaried out of his position by the Koch brothers, and in his place we got Trey Gowdy, who's one of the worst politicians in modern history. So we need to try to provide some space to bring back good faith Republicans into the fold, to create some space for conservatives to to come back into the fold, to recognize that their legacy, that there is a legacy of environmental stewardship in their party, the sort of Teddy Roosevelt legacy. And we're not going to win back in this greatly polarized ideological atmosphere that we now live in. We're not going to win back the majority of the Republican Party to the side of climate action and environmental protection. But I think that there's a solid, 10 or 20% that we can bring back into the fold. And then that gives us sort of a governing coalition for climate action, if you've got Democrats and moderate Republicans in agreement on matters of policy, we can see real progress. And I think that's where things are headed. I think that if Democrats take back the Senate, if we have a Democratic president, then I think there will be enough pressure for some Republicans to cross over and join Democrats and become part of the solution. And so we've got to create some space for them. Republicans aren't intrinsically the enemy here. The current Republican Party is the problem. And it's important for Republicans of good faith to recognize that their party no longer represents them. And we need to invite them back into the fold.
Thank you. We have a question. What are some of the best sources for solid information on climate change for those who want to learn more?
Thanks. Great question. I love when it comes to dealing with climate change, contrarians and denialism. There's a great site called Skeptical Science that has a list of all the standard denialist arguments and the responses to them. It's really useful for to have at Thanksgiving when you have that climate change denying uncle who always comes armed with the latest Fox News climate change denier talking points, and you can just have Skeptical Science website there and refute him in real time. So when it comes to sort of the basic science, Skeptical Science is great. There's a blog I helped co-found called Real Climate, which is a little more in the weeds. It's aimed somewhat more at people who are somewhat versed in the basic sort of issues and questions in the science of climate change. There's a wonderful website, Climate Communication. .org, I think it is, that is run by a colleague of mine, Susan Joy Hastel, who's one of the leading climate communicators. It's very accessible. It has a lot of information. There are, the National Academy of Sciences, the National Science Foundation, and even under the current administration, you can actually find reasonably reliable information at the NOAA website, so those are the ones that come to mind immediately. That's another way of being informed, of course, is on social media, Facebook and Twitter, and actually following some leading climate advocates and climate scientists. I myself am there in the mix, but there are a number of leading climate scientists and climate communication experts who are active in getting new information out there, because of course, with climate change, it's such a fast, evolving a world now, where every day, a new study comes out that provides additional context, and it's sort of important to sort of keep pace with the the ever sort of evolving array of evidence and information and understanding. And social media is a really good way to do that. I like Twitter quite a bit for that, and it's just about finding some trusted voices, people that you can trust, who are experts on the science and don't have a political axe to grind. And often that's a great way to get information, because they'll be linking to the latest studies, they'll be providing some context for them. That's actually primarily these days how I get my sort of daily diet of climate information, is through my Twitter feed. And that's all about finding the right folks to follow, people you can trust and people who are informed and have expertise.
Thank you, Mike. Are there any documentaries or series that you particularly like as well?
Yeah, well, there's one I don't. That's Planet of the Humans, Michael Moore.
Okay.
Do not watch that. You will expose yourself to so much misinformation, and it's very dispiriting as well. But no, there are a lot of great climate-themed documentaries out there. Before the Flood, it was a Leo DiCaprio documentary. It's a few years old now, but it still stands up very well. There was another recent HBO documentary.
Ice on Fire.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah,
Ice on Fire,
it's
which
really
also,
great.
yeah, thanks. There was a wonderful documentary that was first shown by the BBC a year ago, on Earth Day a year ago, and frustratingly, you couldn't watch it in the US because BBC has this firewall that prevents people in other countries from watching it, but it appeared on Earth Day this year on PBS. It's a David Attenborough climate change documentary, and it's one of the best documentaries that I think has yet been done. And of course, Attenborough is just sort of this icon, and so he has this sort of authoritative demeanor, and it's just it's a great overall sort of treatment of the full problem, from the science to the impacts to the policy dimensions, and I could go on there. CNN actually had a really good climate, 1 hour climate documentary about a month ago. Bill Weir was sort of the host. I forgot the title of it, but you can find that as well. So there's a lot of good stuff out there. There's some bad stuff out there as well, so it can be treacherous waters to navigate, but the ones I mentioned would be a good place to start.
Great, thank you. And this will be our last question for this evening. What about the religious arguments around environmental stewardship? Are Republicans more influenced by that?
Thanks. It's a great question. You know, I think religion has unfortunately been used as a wedge by, the fossil fuel interests. They have attempted to divide the religious community. In my view, the natural message of the Bible is one of valuing stewardship, is, that we are stewards of creation. It's our responsibility not to destroy this planet. And so there is a, there's certainly a theological school where, environmental sustainability plays a central role in the tenets of, the Christian faith and other religions. And what's happened, unfortunately, is that conservative interests have tried to turn some evangelicals against climate action, using contorted arguments that really betray the true teachings of the Bible, in my view. Bob Inglis, who I mentioned, is an evangelical conservative from South Carolina. And the reason that he chose to speak out on climate was he felt it was his, it was incumbent upon him, as as a good Christian, to speak out about what he saw as the greatest threat to creation, the threat of unmitigated climate change. And he began speaking on the House floor about the importance of doing, acting on climate, as a conservative Republican, and that earned him the ire of the Koch brothers, and they threw millions of dollars against his election campaign to remove him from his congressional seat. But he now travels around the country trying to convince conservatives and evangelicals about why it is important for them to support action on climate. And so that's really important. Evangelical Christians, as far as I'm concerned, are a natural ally when it comes to the climate battle. And it's unfortunate that, again, that some vested interests have sought to sort of poison the well by turning them against their own natural inclinations to support, basic tenets of environmental stewardship. We need to encourage, again, bring them into the fold, and recognize that whether or not you're a person of faith, there's an important role for the faith community to play. This is a big tent. We need all of the allies that we can bring to the table, and so that's the faith community is an extremely important ally in this battle.
Great. Thank you, Mike. So we're going to be wrapping up this webinar. I would like to quickly just chat about the 21st Century Leadership Circle. As Nancy can attest, this is how we make events like this possible. It is the backbone of our fundraising efforts. So if you are not already a member of the 21st Century Leadership Circle, please reach out to us after this webinar, and we would love to have you a part of our circle. And I would like to pass it off to Nancy for closing.
Thank you, Ava, and thank you, Mike, so much for your passion and for your science. That combination is something that we sorely need in this world, and you really give it to us. I hope that those of you who came today, and thank you all those who are here, and a few people have already left, but I know that they also were part of making this event happen. When we planned this back in November, who knew that we would be doing it this way, but everybody pitched in, and I really appreciate everybody's commitment. If you're here today, you've made a difference by being here, and Mike, you of course especially.
An honor.
I want to be sure that you know that you can find the Center County Democratic Committee online at centercountydems.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. And I want to remind everyone that 2 weeks from today, on June 2nd, is the primary election in Pennsylvania. If you haven't already sent in your mail-in ballot, do it soon, or if you're going to go to the polls, make time to do it on that Tuesday. And finally, between now and November, we have so much to do, as Mike pointed out, and as I'm sure everyone here knows. Please be part of it. Be in touch whatever way you can. We're around. We're going. And Ava, would you also make sure that people who register here do have a chance to contact Kara Package about her program of getting people involved at a local level?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you again to everyone who's here.
Yeah,
Thank
thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.